Well, let me describe one program, a powerful one that the federal government pursued in the mid-20th century. It was a program of the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administrations. They designed to move the entire white working class and middle class populations out of urban areas into single family homes in all white suburbs that these federal agencies were creating everywhere in the country. It was a racially explicit program. At the time, we were a manufacturing economy. Factories were located in urban areas near deep water ports and railroad terminals, so they could get their parts and ship their final products. And most of those urban areas were somewhat diverse, both blacks and whites living in the same urban areas because they all had to be able to walk to work, maybe take short streetcar rides. Many didn't have automobiles. Employees of banks and insurance companies and the other service companies that were serving those manufacturing industries likewise had to be accessible to the factory locations, the manufacturing locations. Well, the federal government had a program designed to move the whites out of those urban areas into single family homes in all white suburbs that the federal government was creating. In my book, The Color of Law, the example I give, but this is true everywhere in the country, it's just an example, it's not unique, was Levittown, east of New York City. Perhaps you've heard of it. 17,000 homes in one place. In Nassau County, east of New York, an enormous project. The builder, William Levitt, was a bigot. If he'd left to his own devices, he would not have sold a home in his development to an African American. But he wasn't left to his own devices because he couldn't get the financing to build this project. No bank would lend him the money to do it. They thought it was a crazy idea. We were not a suburban country at that time. Who was going to want to live in these places? The only way that Levitt could build this project of 17,000 homes was by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, submitting his plans for the project, the architectural design of the houses, the layout of the streets, the materials he was going to use, and a commitment required by the federal government that he never sell a home to an African American. The federal government even required, the FHA and VA even required Levitt and builders like him all over the country to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was not the action of rogue bureaucrats working in the FHA or VA. It was written out in a policy manual of the Federal Housing Administration. The manual was distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to evaluate the applications of developers, of builders for federal bank guarantees to build their suburban developments. The manual said that you could not recommend for a federal bank guarantee a project of a developer where he was going to sell to African Americans. The manual went so far as to say that you couldn't even recommend for a federal bank guarantee an all-white project if it was going to be located near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, and I'm quoting, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal policy manual said. This notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. Levitt, as I said before, would have discriminated if he had the choice. But if the federal government had followed its constitutional and legal responsibilities, he would have had to, if he wanted the bank guarantee, he would have to commit to sell homes on a non-discriminatory basis. And at the time, both African Americans and whites could almost equally have afforded homes like that. Levittown, and this is true of developments all over the country, the homes there sold for about $8,000, $9,000 at the time. And today's inflation-adjusted dollars, that's about $100,000. The homes in these projects, Levittown or any of the others anywhere in the country, as you know, no longer sell for $100,000. They sell for $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, in some places $1 million or more. The white families who bought those homes, subsidized by the federal government with FHA and VA mortgages after the initial guarantees of the development loans, they didn't move to these places because they wanted to get rich. Nobody had any idea that these homes were going to appreciate in value as they did. We had a housing shortage at the time. They moved there because they needed a place to live. Returning war veterans were coming home with no housing available because no civilian housing was built during the World War II, and very little was built during the Great Depression that preceded it. So the white families needed a place to live. They took advantage of this federal program, but unexpectedly, they got rich. The homes appreciated in value. The white homeowners and their successors gained equity from the appreciation and the value of those homes. They used that equity, that wealth, to send their children to college. They used it to perhaps take care of temporary emergencies like unemployment, temporary, or maybe a medical emergency. They used it to subsidize their retirement so they could be more comfortable than Social Security alone would provide. And they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited by explicit racial policy of the federal government for participating in this program that generated wealth for whites and denied it to African Americans. Today, African American incomes on average are about 60% of white incomes. African American wealth is about 5% of white wealth. You would think that with a 60% income ratio, the wealth ratio would be 60% as well. People can save the same amount of money from the same incomes. But the reason for that wealth gap is almost entirely attributable to these unconstitutional and unlawful policies practiced by the federal government that have never been remedied.